Now the cranial nerves, the first olfactory, usually we are not keeping the olfactory nerve. The optic nerve will be kept, first cranial nerve, the second one. And when you get, usually the presentation will be the patient has had a blurring of vision. So examine the relevant cranial nerve of this patient. Either you get in the neurological examination or you will get in the station 5. So there are 5 components to be tested when you are asked to do the optic nerve examination. Finished now. Okay, so 1 is the acuity of vision, 2 the color vision, 3 the afferent pupillary defect, 4 the peripheral field, and 5 the fundus. These are the 5 domains of the optic nerve examination. Okay, so you start with the acuity of the vision. And optic nerve, you know the pathway, that is when the light reflex is falling onto the retina, okay, through the pupil, it goes into the retina. From the retina, the fibers go, mainly there are 2 types of photoreceptors in the retina, that is called rods and cones. The rods are for the scotopic vision, that is the night vision, and the cones are for the photopic vision or the day vision. The cones are more powerful than the rods. There are about 10 million rods and 5 million, 100 million rods and 5 million cones in the retina. And these cones have 2 important speciality. One, they are important for color vision. Second, for high spatial resolution. The cones are very important. And where do you find the cones in the retina? Mainly in the macula and in the fovea. The macula is the area 1.5 temporal to the optic disc, and that is concerned with the central 10 degree of vision, and that is the most important vision for a human being. Suppose the macular vision is lost, he will be legally blind. Okay, so this macula and fovea contains only cones. There are no rods. That is one. So the cones are important for the color vision as well as the high spatial resolution. And the fibers coming from the macula are the nerve fibers which come to the optic disc, and then optic nerve, then optic chiasma, where the nasal fibers are crossing and the temporal fibers uncrossed. Then comes to the optic tract, then the lateral geniculate body, which is a relay station in the thalamus, and then optic radiation, then the occipital cortex. This is the visual pathway. Okay, so any lesion anterior to the optic chiasma can affect the acuity of vision. One, the pupillary reflex can be abnormal, and the afferent pupillary defect will be abnormal. Any lesion anterior to the optic chiasma. Now, you should remember that the pupillary reflex, the light reflex and accommodation reflex, there are 2 reflexes, isn't it? So when you are looking for the pupillary, when you are looking for the pupillary reflexes, always look at the pupillary reflex in a dim light, and while the patient is looking at a distant target, not the near object, the distant target. Ask him to look at a distant object, and then you flash the light and see the pupillary reflex. The light reflex will be very brisk. If the light reflex is brisk, then you don't have to look for the accommodation reflex, because there is no condition where there will be a dissociation of light reflex being present and accommodation reflex is absent. But reverse can occur. Accommodation reflex can be present and light reflex can be absent in Argyle Robertson pupil or a mid-brain lesion. Okay, so if you ask him to look at a distant object and look at the pupillary reflex, and the pupillary reflex is present, then don't waste your time for the accommodation. Accommodation will be present, because accommodation is more powerful than the light reflex. And a little bit of anatomy of the light reflex. Then the light is falling on the retina, and this is conveyed through the macula to the optic disc. Through the optic disc, it goes to the optic nerve, then goes to the optic chiasma, then the optic tract, the lateral geniculate body. Here, the fibers for the pupillary reflex and the accommodation will leave the lateral geniculate body, go to the pretectal nucleus in the midbrain. From there, it will go to both Edinger-Westphal nuclei, and Edinger-Westphal nuclei will supply the sphincter pupillae, and the pupil will constrict. That is the light reflex. The remaining, the light energy for the formation of the object, that will go to the occipital cortex, because this the action potential has to be converted into a target image. Okay. So when you are looking for the, if the patient is given at acute blurred vision, then you have to look all these 5 parameters given the Rosenbaum card. This is a pocket Snellen chart, all of you should carry. This is called a Rosenbaum card. Okay, this is a pocket Snellen chart. Usually in the real scenario, you should be away from the Snellen chart is 20 feet. 20 feet difference. The distance should be there. But here you need only 14 inches. 14 inches means almost one hand. 14 inches is enough. So you ask him to read the lowest one and then go up. Okay? And at the same time, you should look for the color vision. Ask him these 2 colors to recognize, either green or red, to ask him to recognize. So with this Snellen chart, pocket Snellen chart, color vision and acuity can be finished. And you should always remember, when the patient has got an acquired color blindness, that is suggestive of an optic neuropathy. And 100% the patient will have a lesion anterior to the optic chiasma. So that is the importance of the acuity of vision and color vision. And now coming to the peripheral field of vision. Peripheral field of vision, always you make sure that you are at the same level of the patient. Some of the candidates just come in, the patient is sitting on the chair and he is doing like this and fails in the exam. So make sure either they will provide you 2 chairs where you can keep the patient on a chair and you sit on the chair at a hand distance and do that, or you bend down and come to the level of the patient and keep this extended hand midway between you and him. Midway between, not go very close to him, don't go very close to him. So you should be midway between you and him. Then ask him to look at me and then move your finger. Which side are moving? Which one? Right. Now, left side. Now, both sides. By doing this, what all things you have ruled out? Patient does not have a bitemporal hemianopia. Patient does not have a homonymous hemianopia. These 2 ruled out. You understand? So the optic chiasma, and behind the optic chiasma you have ruled out. He doesn't have. So now you can look at the individual eye, because unilateral scotoma in one eye is suggestive of either the optic nerve lesion or a retinal lesion. Okay? So now you just ask him to Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
So all the 4 quarters you have to individually.
You have to close
you have to close. You have to close your eye. Yeah. And then the other eye. Okay. So first do this one and then do the individual one to find out whether monoocular scotoma is there or not. So peripheral field of vision is over. And then the next one is the swimming flash test, which you have to always do, because you just throw the light on the abnormal eye. There will not be any constriction of the pupil, because the light reflex is not carried to the lateral geniculate body, so there will not be any constriction. But when you come to the normal eye, this will also start constricting, because it's a consensual reaction. Because when the light is fallen on the normal eye, that is carried through the optic tract to the lateral geniculate body and then pretectal nucleus, and that will give to both Edinger-Westphal nuclei. So that will give instruction to the sphincter pupillae to constrict. Whereas on the abnormal side, the light reflex is not going. So when you throw light on the abnormal side, there is no constriction. When you come to the normal eye, both eye will constrict. When come back to the abnormal eye, you can see in spite of the light, the pupils start dilating. There is no afferent reflex. So that is called afferent pupillary defect or Marcus-Gunn phenomena, which is characteristic, which is very sensitive sign for an optic neuropathy anterior to the optic chiasma. Even posterior to the optic chiasma, you can have this effect, but only one half of this pupil and one half of this pupil will be affected. That is very difficult to visually perceive. So visually perceivable afferent pupillary defect is suggestive of an optic neuropathy anterior to the optic chiasma. Understand? So you have tested the acuity of vision, you have tested the color vision, you have tested the peripheral field of vision, and then you have tested the afferent pupillary defect or the Marcus-Gunn phenomena. So these four will give you an idea whether the patient has got anterior to the optic chiasma or posterior to the optic chiasma. Now look at the disc. The disc is very important. How much I teach you, you will not learn the disc, but you have to experience yourself by looking at the disc. Suppose if you look at the disc and if the patient has got a disc edema, okay, it can be either papilledema or it could be papillitis. So when you see a disc edema, okay, it could be either papilledema or papillitis. Okay, papillitis. Papillitis is a part of the optic neuropathy or optic nerve damage. Either of the two can produce a papillitis. Now, how will you find differential? And before that, you have to make sure that this disc edema is true disc edema. It is not a pseudo disc edema. Okay, how will you find out that? There are 5 mechanical signs and 5 vascular signs you have to look for to differentiate between a pseudo disc edema and a true disc edema. What are the mechanical? One is the loss of physiological cup. You know, you look at the fundus, at the center of the optic disc there is a cup. That loss of the physiological cup, one. Second, elevation of the disc. You can see the disc is elevated from the rest of the surface. Third one, the margins will be blurred. The margins are imperceptibly merging into the surrounding. Fourth one, it may be difficult for you to find out retinal edema. Surrounding the disc you can see the retina is swollen. Fifth one, retinal folds. Sometimes you can see one bridge-like thing over the retina. That's a retinal folds. Folds. Yeah. So, one is loss of physiological cup. Second, the disc is elevated from the surrounding surface. Then margins are blurred. Then retinal edema and retinal folds. These are the 5 mechanical signs. Now 5 vascular signs are there. One, hyperemia of the disc. The disc becomes red. 2, the veins of the retina, the disc become tortuous and congested. 3, there can be peripapillary hemorrhages. Around the disc you can see a lot of hemorrhages. 4, there can be cotton wool spots in the retina, which is due to the nerve fiber layer infarct. And 5, there can be exudates. So these are the 10 signs. Out of this, a few of them you've picked up, you know this is a true disc edema. Suppose if the physiological cup is lost, the disc to you see it seems it is raised from the surrounding surface. There are a few peripapillary hemorrhages and a few exudates are there. You know this patient has got a true disc edema. It's not a pseudo disc edema. What is the cause of the pseudo disc edema? The commonest is a benign congenital abnormality like a drusen of the disc. Drusens are calcified deposits in the optic disc, which will give you an impression that this patient has got disc edema, but all the other characteristic signs will not be there. Okay. Now again, so you have differentiated between pseudo disc edema and true disc edema. The true disc edema can be either papilledema or papillitis. What is the difference between papilledema and papillitis? Papilledema is usually due to raised intracranial pressure due to any cause. Second, it will be bilateral. Third, patient will never complain of any visual symptoms. These are the three things which will help you to say this patient has got a papilledema. Disc edema means it is usually unilateral, except in one condition, hypertensive crisis, it can be bilateral. Hypertensive crisis, it's not papilledema, it is a disc edema, and it will be bilateral. This is the only situation where you get a disc edema or a papillitis on bilateral, that is hypertensive crisis. All other conditions will be unilateral. And disc edema patients will complain of visual impairment. So there is a visual impairment, so you have to go back to look the acuity of vision, color vision, then afferent pupillary defect, peripheral field of vision. All these you should test in the case of disc edema. All will be impaired. Acuity of vision can be reduced, color vision will be lost, peripheral field there will be scotomas, and afferent pupillary defect will be there because the afferent pathway is affected, and disc, you look at the disc is swollen. What are the common causes of the papillitis then? Papillitis can be due to various types of optic neuropathy: inflammatory, infective, infiltrative, then compressive, metabolic, hereditary, traumatic. These are the 7 causes. So what are the causes? We will ask you what are the causes of inflammatory. Most important is demyelinating diseases like multiple sclerosis or sarcoidosis. Infective HIV is very common now. Infiltrative leukemic infiltration into the optic nerve can produce a papillitis. Compressive, any optic nerve compression can produce a papillitis. Okay. Then traumatic. Okay. And then vascular. Vascular, mainly anterior ischemic optic neuropathy and central retinal vein occlusion can produce disc edema. These are the common causes. So the disc edema will be usually unilateral, except one condition where there is hypertensive crisis where it will be bilateral. Patient will complain of visual symptoms, and you look all this will be abnormal. In a papilledema, your acuity of vision will be normal, color vision will be normal, peripheral field if you do, there will be only an enlargement of the blind spot. The blind spot corresponds to the optic disc. Optic disc does not have any photoreceptors, so that is why it is a blind spot. This blind spot will be enlarged because there is edema of that disc. Okay, that is the only abnormality you will find in a papilledema. Otherwise, everything will be normal. So that is the difference between papilledema and disc edema. So that is optic nerve. Now coming to the third, fourth, and sixth cranial nerves. That is the eyeball. Okay. So I don't know whether you would like to have a little bit of neurology of the third nerve. Third nerve nucleus has got a peculiarity. It is this is the dorsal nucleus. This is the ventral nucleus. This is the caudal central nucleus. This is the Edinger Westphal nucleus. Okay, and then this is the intermediate column of cells. This is the medial column of cells. Okay, dorsal nucleus supplies the inferior rectus muscle. So there are 6 extraocular muscles. If you do like this, this is the superior rectus, this is inferior rectus, adducted eye, inferior oblique, superior oblique. This is medial rectus, this is lateral rectus. So in the lateral rectus, abduction, in dip position, elevation is superior rectus, depression is inferior rectus. Adducted position, medial rectus is contracted, this is inferior oblique, this is superior oblique. These are the 6 muscles. Okay. So dorsal nucleus, inferior rectus, ventral nucleus, medial rectus, intermediate column of cells, inferior oblique, medial column of cells. The peculiarity is it supplies the opposite superior rectus. Opposite superior rectus. Now comes to the caudal central nucleus, bilateral levator papillus superioris, Edinger Westphal nucleus, bilateral sphincter pupillae. I will explain to you again. This is the nuclear mass of the third nerve. The dorsal nucleus supplies the inferior rectus of the same side. The ventral nucleus supplies the medial rectus of the same side. the intermediate column of cells supplies the inferior oblique of the same side. Now, the caudal central nucleus supplies bilateral divided by the superioris. Meningeal nucleus bilateral sphincter pupillae, and the medial column of cells will supply the opposite superior rectus. So, if there is a nuclear lesion of the third nerve, what will happen? Patient will have bilateral ptosis, patient will have bilateral internal ophthalmoplegia, patient will have opposite superior rectus palsy and unilateral third nerve palsy. So that is nuclear lesion. See, any cranial nerve lesions also can be supranuclear, infranuclear, or nuclear. All the nuclear and infranuclear lesions, patient will complain of diplopia. Diplopia, double vision, especially when looking in the direction of the paralyzed muscle. Now your task is to find out whether this patient has got a monoocular diplopia or a binocular diplopia. What will you do? You have your task is to, this diplopia can be either monoocular or a binocular diplopia. So what will you do now? Or you ask him to close one eye. If the diplopia disappears, it's a binocular diplopia. If after closing the one eye, if the diplopia is still persisting, it's a monoocular diplopia. So what are the causes of monoocular diplopia? It could be either corneal abnormality like keratoconus, or it could be lens abnormality like cataract, or it could be a foveal traction. These are the common causes of uniocular diplopia. Whereas binocular diplopia is always due to either third, fourth or sixth nerve palsy. Okay. Another squint, most of these patients will have a squint. Squint means the deviated eye. Okay. One eye will be deviated, and so that produces, because of the malalignment of the visual axis, the eye will be not parallel in the primary position. That produces the squint. Okay. This squint can be either paralytic squint or a non-paralytic squint. What is the difference between paralytic squint and non-paralytic squint? Non-paralytic squint develops because of the malalignment of the visual axis from childhood. The visual axes are not aligned properly, so the fusion of the image is not occurring properly in the brain. So that produces the non-paralytic squint or the congenital squint. How will you differentiate between a paralytic squint and non-paralytic squint? In a non-paralytic squint, usually it is children, it happens, and then it can be carried on to the adult. That is one. If you look at the individual muscles, all will be full. That is one. Second, patient will never complain of diplopia. That is two. Third, the squinting eye will have a defective vision. Why? Because from childhood, the visual axis were malaligned, so the patient will have diplopia. To suppress the diplopia, the vision will be suppressed. So that is why that eye has defective vision. Okay. Now comes an important thing, primary deviation and secondary deviation. What is primary deviation? What is secondary deviation? So you ask him to look to an object, okay, and then you will know which eye is squinting eye. Okay, you will get an idea which is a squinting eye. Ask him to look at an object, your finger, and then the apparently normal eye you close. So what will happen? Now the squinting eye, the abnormal eye, will move to fix the object. That is called the primary deviation. You understand? So you ask him to look at the object, and then the apparently normal eye you close. Then the other eye will move to fix the object. That means that eye was squinting, and that is called the primary deviation. Now you remove this hand. This eye will also move in the same direction as the other eye moved. That is called the secondary deviation. The secondary deviation will be more than primary deviation in a paralytic squint, whereas in a non-paralytic squint, both are equal. That is how you differentiate between the paralytic and the non-paralytic squint. So one, congenital squint occurs from childhood. Two, the eye movements will be full. He will never complain of diplopia. primary and secondary deviations are equal, and the squinting eye will have a defective vision or amblyopia. These are the 5 characteristics of the congenital squint. But other acquired squint, definitely he will have diplopia. And when the patient complains of diplopia, don't forget to ask whether the 2 images are seen side by side or partially up and down. This you can ask. That is one. Why? Because if it is side by side, you know either it could be due to the 3rd nerve or the 6th nerve. If it is partially up and down, you know it is due to the 4th nerve, because the superior oblique muscle, the action of the superior oblique muscle is adducted eye depression. Okay, so when you are walking down in the stairs, the main muscle is the superior oblique. The eye is adducted and the superior oblique is depressing the eye. If that is paralyzed, when you are climbing down the stairs, you will feel there are 2 steps. So you will go into the fall step and you will fall down. You understand? So that is why asking him about the images is very important. If it is side by side, then you know it is either 6th nerve or the 3rd nerve. If it is partially up and down, then that goes in favor of the 4th nerve and is due to superior oblique muscle. Okay. So you have looked at it. Now the 3rd nerve, what all things is the unilateral 3rd nerve palsy you can have a ptosis, because the levator papillae superioris muscle is supplied to the 3rd nerve. You can have a defective adduction, okay, and you have elevation is suppressed, and here also the elevation is suppressed. The only movement will be the lateral rectus, which is pulling the eye towards that side, and the superior oblique, which is intact, which will produce a little bit of depression. So outward and downward displaced eye will be there in a 3rd nerve palsy with ptosis. Now ptosis can be due to 2 reasons. One, it can be due to either Horner syndrome, or it can be due to the 3rd nerve palsy. So whenever you see a patient with a partial ptosis, your task is to find out whether it is really due to 3rd nerve palsy or whether it is due to Horner syndrome. Now what is Horner syndrome? It comes with the hypothalamus, brainstem, okay, and then comes to the C8D1, the spinal segment, where there is a lateral horn, okay. From there it comes out to the anterior nerve root, okay, ansa cervicalis, to the 3 ganglia there, the inferior, middle and superior cervical ganglia. Superior cervical ganglia is situated at the level of the atlas vertebra, so it comes and synapse here, and the postganglionic fibers go through the carotid artery, carotid sheath, to the foramen nasserum, into the cavernous sinus, and come out, and then through the 3rd nerve fibers, it supplies the smooth muscle, 2 smooth muscles in the upper and lower eyelid, called the Muller's and orbitalis muscle, and also it supplies the blood vessels of the eye. Okay, this is what the sympathetic fibers are doing. So what will happen if the sympathetic fibers are paralyzed? What will happen? The Muller's and orbitalis muscle will be dysfunctional. What is the function of these muscles? These muscles contradict the contraction of the orbicularis oculi muscle, which is supplied to the facial nerve. The orbicularis oculi action is to close the eye, okay, but this is opposed by these smooth muscle fibers to keep the eye open. So when these smooth muscle fibers are paralyzed as a result of the sympathetic tract involvement, the upper eyelid will be tossed, the lower eyelid will be pulled up, so the narrow palpebral fissure, and it will give you an impression that the eyeball has gone inside the ophthalmos. Not only that, the patient can have a sweating abnormality or anhydrosis. So these are the 4 signs of the Horner syndrome. The patient will have partial ptosis, patient will have a meiosis, patient will have anhydrosis. And enophthalmos. Enophthalmos is really true, but it is only a visual illusion because of this upside down ptosis of the eyelid. Now you want to differentiate between these two, and you ask him to look up. If all the ptosis disappears, it is due to Horner syndrome. If all the ptosis disappears, you are sure 100% sure it is due to the Horner syndrome. Then you look for the other signs of the Horner syndrome, that is meiosis and the lack of sweating. If the ptosis is persisting, it is due to the third nerve palsy. Then you look for the other signs of the third nerve palsy, the pupillary dilatation and the other ocular muscles. Okay. So third, fourth and sixth is over. Now the fifth. Fifth nerve, you know, it has got 4 nuclei. One mesencephalic nucleus in the midbrain. Then there is 3 nuclei in the pons. That is the chief motor nucleus and the sensory nucleus, and then one in the spinal cord, that is the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. There are 4 nuclei. So they carry all the pain and temperature and the common sensations of the face and the forehead, and also the muscles of mastication. All muscles of mastication are supplied by the trigeminal nerve. So what you do is you roughly touch sensation over the ophthalmic, maxillary and mandibular division, okay, and we won't allow you to do the corneal reflex, because cornea, if you all of you go and poke into the cornea, the patient will develop aberration, so we will never ask you to do the corneal reflex. Only test the ophthalmic division, the maxillary division, the mandibular division with a cotton, and then you can use some sharp subject for the pain, okay, and that is enough. Corneal reflex we will not do. And then ask him to clench the teeth, yeah, for the masseter, and then medial pterygoid and lateral pterygoid and temporalis muscle, but the masseter is the most important one, okay. So that is the fifth one. Now comes to the seventh one. Seventh one you can get in the exam either as a part of the upper motor or lower motor neuron facial palsy. And seventh nerve, again, you should remember it is situated in the pons, mainly in the pons. Seventh nerve main nucleus, but there is one nucleus here called superior salivatory nucleus and one is called solitary nucleus. Okay, so what happens is main supply is the seventh nerve supplies the all muscles of facial expression. Okay, but the superior salivatory nucleus is concerned with the parasympathetic supply to the lacrimal gland and also the parasympathetic supply to the submandibular and salivary glands of the mouth. So salivation and lacrimation. Okay. Solitary nucleus, the posterior, the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, the taste sensation is coming to the solitary nucleus. Okay. So if there is a seventh nerve palsy, you should test for the lacrimation, you should test for the salivation, you should look for the taste sensation, and then the motor part of the seventh nerve. Okay. So this is important. Why? Because it gives a localization of the lesion. You should remember this nerve is coming out, and this seventh nerve carrying there are 2 nerves together. The fibers coming from the superior salivatory nucleus for the parasympathetic fibers and the taste fibers come together to the nervus intermedius of Risberg, which is part of the facial nerve, and the 8th nerve is coming below. They get into the internal acoustic meatus and then come here in the canal. There is a ganglion, the geniculate ganglion, and then post ganglion the facial nerve comes out, stylomastoid foramen comes to the parotid gland and supply all the facial muscles of the facial expression. Okay. Suppose if the patient has a lesion proximal to the geniculate ganglion in the internal acoustic meatus, what will happen? Patient will have loss of lacrimation, patient will have loss of taste, patient will have loss of salivation and unilateral facial palsy. So that is why any lower motor neuron, how will you differentiate between lower motor and upper motor? Lower motor neuron lesion, the whole half of the face will be affected, whereas in upper motor, only the lower half because of the bilateral innervation of the upper part of the nucleus. If you are seeing a lower motor neuron lesion of the facial nerve, then you look at the eyes for the lacrimation. At least you can see the conjunctiva whether it is wet or not, and ask him whether you feel dry in the left eye or the right eye, wherever is the paralysis. Then ask him to put out the tongue and look at the moisture of the tongue. If it is moisture is there, then the salivation is intact. Okay, so the lacrimation, salivation, and then look for the facial muscles. Ask, there are 3 muscles only you have to look for the facial nerve. Ask him to show me the teeth. Yeah, this is the rhizorius muscle that produces the symmetric deviation both angle. Then ask him to close the eyes. Nalla powerful eye close. There is orbicularis oculi. and then ask him to frown his head, that is the frontalis muscle. So the frontalis muscle, the orbicularis oculi, and the risorius. These three important muscles you test for the facial nerve. And then look at the lacrimation, salivation. Also you have to look for that. Then you will give it an idea. And taste, we are not asking you, but you can ask the patient whether taste is okay or not. Okay, in a lower motor neuron facial palsy. And if you get a lower motor neuron facial palsy, don't forget to look for the 6th nerve and 8th nerve and 5th nerve. We expect you to do this. We are giving you a Bell's palsy patient to see that you know the anatomy of the 7th nerve. So the 5th nerve in the CP angle, then comes to the 6th nerve, then comes to the 7th nerve, then comes to the 8th nerve. So these 4 nerves have to be tested. Upper motor neuron lesion, very clear. You will have only the lower half of the face. Then we expect you to look for the upper limb and lower limb for the hemiplegia. That's all we are looking for. So if you see a upper motor neurofacial palsy on one side, then you tell the examiner. If you are asked only to examine the cranial nerve, you can tell the examiner, I would like to look at the upper limb and lower limb because he has got an upper motor neurofacial palsy. Possibility of hemiplegia is there. So can I examine? Then you say, okay, you go ahead. Okay, that is the 7th. Now 8th nerve. There are 2-3 tests. 8th nerve, actually the patient will be given to you because if the patient has got a acoustic neuroma, for example, a neurofibroma patient is coming, and then we will keep you saying that this patient has got a defective hearing in one ear. So what you can do is there are 2-3 tests. One is the hum test. First you make sure, ask him which ear he has got a defective hearing. Okay. Then ask him to do the hum test. Hum test is ask him to do that is humming. If that humming is localized to the defective ear, then you know this is a conduction deafness. If he says that humming is heard in the normal ear, then it is a sensory neural hearing defect. So this makes your exam very brisk, and you know you are almost sure that I am dealing with a sensory neural hearing defect. So of course I have to look for all other cranial nerves in that CP angle. Again, 8th nerve, the same thing I am telling you. So hum test is very important. Then second, the Rennes and the Weber's test. And you have to use the 556. I think I have already 281. 128 is for the posterior column sensations, whereas 556 or the higher frequency you should check for the Weber's and the Rennes test. Rennes test, you ask him to കേൾക്കുന്നുണ്ടോ? ഇപ്പോഴോ? ഏതാണ് നല്ലത്? ഫ്രണ്ടിൽ വെച്ചതാണോ ബാക്കിൽ വെച്ചതാണോ? So this is enough for the Rennes test. You keep in front, ask him whether he is hearing, and then you keep at the back. Not to wait till the vibration is over. You just keep it like this. Keep it like this. Ask him which is better. If the air conduction is more than bone conduction, then you know either the patient has got a sensory neural hearing defect or the normal hearing. But if this happens in the defective ear, then you know this patient has got a sensory neural hearing defect. Then you do the Weber's test. Weber's test. Okay. So he says it is symmetrical. If it is asymmetrical, then you ask him where exactly is better heard. If it is in the abnormal ear, then you know that is the conduction deafness. If it is in the normal ear, the sensory neural hearing defect. Then if you established this, then you always remember that you have to look for the other cranial nerves in that CP angle, 5th, 6th, 7th. Please examine these 3 cranial nerves and show the examiner that I am doing this to rule out any CP angle lesion, because CP angle lesions can produce all this cranial nerve involvement. Okay, that is 8. Now 9th and 10th. 9th and 10th is very simple. They supply the muscles of the pharynx and larynx. So the 9th, you know, that supplies the stylopharyngeus muscle, and the 10th supplies all the other muscles of the pharynx and larynx. So ask him to say ah, and then we are not asking you to do the gag reflex because that will be very inconvenient for the patient. We'll never do that. So you just say patient ah, and then that is enough. If the palate is moving on either side symmetrically, you know the gag reflex is intact. And then you can, if you want, you can ask him a few questions whether he is able to swallow and if there is any nasal regurgitation. Okay. 9th and 10th patients, most of the time they will be with the NG tube in the exam. So you know this patient has got a 9th and 10th. And then 11th, of course 11th has got 2 parts, the spinal part and the central part. the spinal part is arising from the upper 5 cervical segments and then go through the foramen magnum to join the central part which is coming from the medulla, and then supply all the muscles of the come out and then supply the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid. So you ask him to push the other side, and what is the side there? You feel this and this side, and then raise the shoulders for the trapezius. That is the 11th nerve. 12th nerve, hypoglossal, again situated in the medulla. Ask him and ask him to put out the tongue. Okay. There is one thing which can happen here. I have seen the people failing in the exam. When the patient has got a marked lower motor neuron facial palsy or upper motor neuron facial palsy, when you ask him to put out the tongue, there will be a slight deviation of the tongue. That is because of the proprioceptive sensations have gone. That is why that happens. Then you will evoke 12th nerve palsy. How will you find out if the patient has not 12th or not? Ask him to push the naak which to push here. See, ask him to do this, and here ask him to do this. So if that is powerful, that you know that the 12th is not involved. So in a 7th nerve palsy, when you ask him to put out the tongue will be slightly deviated. That is because of the lack of the proprioception. So to make sure that the 12th is not involved, you ask him to close the mouth and ask him to push the tongue of the cheek with the tongue on either side. That will be very powerful. So you will rule out that the 12th is not there. And one more thing I wanted to tell you in the optic nerve examination, if the patient has got a blurring of the vision, it could be either due to refractive error or it could be due to the optic nerve abnormality. How will you find out that? To differentiate these two. The acuity of vision is reduced. When you tested the acuity of vision, and 2-3 things I will tell you. Acuity of vision always should be tested with the glasses, with the reading glass or with the refractive error glass. Never ask the patient to take out the glass and check the acuity. Acuity should be reduced. So if you have a refractive error and if he is on a glasses, please ask him to keep the glass and then check the acuity of vision. Never remove the glasses. And then how will you find out whether it is a refractive error or whether it is due to the optic nerve and retina which produces the loss of the reduced acuity of vision? You can do a pinhole test. Can we give a small paper? Small paper. Pinhole test. We can do the pinhole test, and that will give you an idea. Just like the hum test in the 8th nerve, the pinhole test in the optic nerve is important. You can either make a hole or you can do like this. This is easier. Make a pinhole with this. See, there's a hole, and then ask him to read through this hole. Hold this and then read. Ask him to hold this and read through that. If the acuity of vision improves, it is due to refractive error. If it does not improve, it could be due to either optic nerve or retinal lesion.